The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, then fell silent. In the operations bunker 30 feet below the Afghan desert, Colonel Marcus Webb stared at the tactical display where 4 green dots had just vanished from the screen. 4 A-10 Thunderbolt IIs, call signs Reaper 1 through 4, had been providing close air support for a surrounded Marine reconnaissance unit in the Helmand Valley. Now there was nothing but electronic ghosts and the suffocating weight of command decisions gone wrong. Reaper flight check-in, Webb transmitted into his headset, his voice steady despite the ice forming in his chest. The silence stretched like a taut wire. Behind him, the operations staff moved with practiced efficiency, but their glances carried the weight of unspoken questions. 4 pilots, 4 $30 million aircraft, gone. The mission had started as routine as anything could be in that corner of hell. The Marines had been tracking a high-value target through the rocky outcroppings near Sangin when they'd walked into what intelligence would later classify as a complex ambush. Taliban forces had positioned themselves with devastating effectiveness, using the terrain to create overlapping fields of fire that turned the valley into a killing funnel. The Marines had called for immediate close air support, and Webb had launched his most experienced pilots into the pre-dawn darkness. Reaper 1 was Captain Marcus "Gunner" Rodriguez, a pilot with over 200 combat sorties. Reaper 2 and 3 were seasoned lieutenants with impeccable records. And then there was Reaper 4, Captain Kira "Ghost" Volkov, the pilot Webb privately considered a liability despite her technical proficiency. She was too quiet, too methodical, lacking the aggressive instincts that made the difference between returning home and becoming a statistic. Her call sign had been assigned mockingly during training. She had a habit of appearing and disappearing from conversations, of operating so smoothly that other pilots forgot she was there. Now Webb wondered if he'd sent 4 pilots to their deaths because he'd underestimated the enemy's capabilities. The Taliban had been increasingly sophisticated in their tactics, and recent intelligence suggested they'd acquired advanced surface-to-air missile systems. The valley's narrow confines would have limited the A-10's maneuvering options, making them vulnerable to ground fire. Webb reached for his coffee, found the cup empty, and realized his hand was trembling slightly. In 30 minutes, he would have to brief his superiors on the loss of 4 aircraft and crew. The weight of those conversations, of the families who would receive visits from casualty notification officers, pressed down on him like the desert heat that would arrive with dawn. But first, he had Marines on the ground who were still counting on support that might never come. The silence from Reaper flight stretched into its 3rd minute. Webb began composing the words he'd never wanted to speak. Mission declared lost. 28 minutes earlier, Captain Kira Volkov had been conducting her final weapon systems check when Rodriguez's voice cut through the comm channel with characteristic confidence. Reaper flight, we've got Marines in contact. Danger close situation. Time to earn our pay, people. His A-10 banked into a shallow descent, its twin engines producing the distinctive whine that announced the arrival of close air support. Volkov adjusted her night vision goggles and studied the terrain below. The Helmand Valley spread out like a moonlit scar across the landscape, all sharp shadows and deceptive depths. Her aircraft, tail number 810965, responded to her inputs with the mechanical precision that had kept her alive through 97 combat sorties. The A-10 wasn't graceful like an F-16 or intimidating like an F-15. It was a flying gun, built around the massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon, designed for one purpose: delivering overwhelming firepower to ground targets. "Ghost, you're tailing Charlie on this one," Rodriguez transmitted. "Stay high and watch for secondary threats while we work the target area." His tone carried the subtle dismissal she'd grown accustomed to, the unspoken message that she was insurance, backup, the pilot they'd call if the real work became too much for the experienced hands. Volkov keyed her mic with a double-click acknowledgement and maintained her position 3,000 feet above the other aircraft. From her vantage point, She could see the muzzle flashes scattered across the valley floor like deadly fireflies. The Marines were pinned down in an L-shaped ambush, with Taliban positions established in prepared fighting positions along the ridgeline and in the boulder fields to the east. Rodriguez rolled into his attack run, the Vulcan cannon chattering its distinctive BRRRT as depleted uranium rounds tore into the enemy positions. Secondary explosions bloomed orange against the rock face where his rounds found ammunition caches. Reaper 2 and 3 followed in sequence, their gun runs methodical and devastating. But Volkov noticed something the others had missed. The muzzle flashes from the ridgeline weren't random. They were concentrated in specific locations, forming a pattern that suggested prepared positions with interlocking fields of fire. More concerning were the brief infrared signatures she'd caught on her targeting pod, heat blooms too large and too brief to be small arms fire. Reaper 1, Ghost, she transmitted. I'm seeing possible launcher signatures on the North Ridge, grid reference. Rodriguez's aircraft exploded in a fireball that lit up the valley like daylight. The A-10 surface-to-air missile had caught him at the bottom of his gun run, when his airspeed was lowest and his escape options most limited. Debris rained down across the desert floor in burning streaks. Reaper 1 is down, Reaper 2 shouted over the radio, his voice cracking with shock. Sam's in the area, Sam's in the... His transmission ended in static as a second missile found its target. Volkov watched Reaper 3 attempt to climb away from the valley, his afterburners painting twin columns of fire against the stars. The third missile tracked him relentlessly, its proximity fuse detonating close enough to shred his port engine and hydraulics. She watched his aircraft enter an unrecoverable spin, the pilot's ejection seat firing milliseconds before the A-10 impacted the valley wall. In less than 90 seconds, Reaper flight had been reduced from 4 aircraft to 1. The radio channels filled with urgent transmissions from the trapped Marines below, their voices carrying the desperation of men who had watched their air support disappear in flames. Volkov found herself alone above a valley filled with enemies who had just demonstrated their ability to swat American aircraft from the sky with frightening effectiveness. Her training told her to climb away, to preserve her aircraft and report the situation. Her orders had been to stay high and observe. But the Marines below were dying, and running would mean abandoning them to their fate. Kira Volkov had earned her call sign through a combination of quiet competence and an unsettling ability to appear where she was least expected. But the name held deeper meaning that none of her squadron mates understood. Her grandmother had been a Soviet pilot during the Great Patriotic War, one of the women who flew obsolete biplanes against the German Wehrmacht. In Russian, ghost meant something different. It meant the spirit that refused to stay dead, the memory that haunted the enemy's nightmares. Banking her into a steep descending turn, Volkov began her attack run against impossible odds. The SA-18 operators on the ridgeline had established a deadly zone of overlapping coverage across the valley floor. These weren't the makeshift fighters that American pilots had grown accustomed to engaging. These were professional soldiers with advanced training and equipment. Their missile systems were newer variants, likely supplied through Iranian networks, with improved guidance systems and countermeasure resistance. Volkov's tactical display painted the threat picture in stark detail. At least 4 confirmed launcher positions, possibly more concealed among the rocky outcroppings. The Taliban had learned from previous engagements, positioning their systems to create multiple engagement opportunities against aircraft attempting to support the trapped Marines. It was a sophisticated trap, and 3 American pilots had already paid the ultimate price for underestimating their opponent's capabilities. But Volkov had advantages her fallen comrades hadn't recognized. Her methodical nature, the very trait that Rodriguez had viewed as a weakness, had led her to study every engagement report from the theater. She'd analyzed the missile system's capabilities, their engagement envelopes, and most importantly, their limitations. The SA-18 was deadly, but it was also predictable if you understood its guidance algorithms. "Reaper 4 to any station," she transmitted on the emergency frequency. "I have Marines in contact and confirmed SAM threats in the valley, requesting immediate SCAD support." Her voice was calm, professional, betraying none of the emotional storm brewing beneath the surface. Her aircraft had become a solitary guardian angel for the men bleeding in the rocks below. The response from the operations center carried Colonel Webb's barely controlled tension. "Reaper 4, be advised SCAD assets are 30 minutes out. Recommend you maintain altitude and observe until support arrives." 30 minutes. Volkov checked her fuel state and calculated time on station. She could maintain orbit for another hour, maybe 90 minutes if she managed her consumption carefully. But the Marines didn't have 30 minutes. The thermal imagery from her targeting pod showed muzzle flashes converging on their position from multiple directions. They were being systematically eliminated while she circled overhead like a vulture. "Understood, Control," she replied, but her hands were already moving across the weapons panel, selecting her remaining ordnance for the engagement she knew was inevitable. She had 1,174 rounds of 30 ammunition, 6 AGM-65 Maverick missiles, and 2 Mark 82 general-purpose bombs. Against a prepared enemy position with integrated air defenses, it might as well have been a slingshot against a tank. But Kira Volkov had grown up listening to her grandmother's stories of night witches and impossible odds. Maria Volkova had flown 312 combat missions in a wood-end fabric biplane, armed with nothing more than light bombs and an indomitable will to protect her homeland. She'd once told young Kira that fear was just intelligence recognizing danger. What mattered was what you did with that recognition. Banking into a wide turn that would bring her around to the valley's eastern approach, Volkov began her descent toward the killing zone. The SA-18 operators would be tracking her, calculating engagement solutions, waiting for her to enter their envelope. But she had studied their tactics, understood their limitations, and most importantly, she had something they didn't expect: the desperate fury of a pilot who had watched her wingmen die. The Marines' radio chatter had grown increasingly urgent, their professional military terminology giving way to the raw profanity of men facing death. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, the reconnaissance team leader, was coordinating their defense with the methodical precision of a career Marine, but even her steady voice carried undertones of desperation. "Ghost, be advised we have wounded down here," Santos transmitted during a brief lull in the firefight. "We need immediate case-vac, but first we need you to suppress those positions on the North Ridge. They've got us zeroed and we can't move." Volkov's targeting pod showed the Marines' position clearly, 12 heat signatures clustered behind inadequate cover in a dried creek bed, surrounded by at least 40 enemy fighters positioned in prepared fighting positions. The tactical situation was hopeless by conventional standards. The smart play was to wait for reinforcements, to let the artillery and SCAD assets clear the way before attempting an attack run. But Marines were dying while she calculated odds and analyzed threat envelopes. Rodriguez, for all his swagger, had been a good pilot and a better man. His wife had just given birth to their second child, a daughter he'd shown pictures of to anyone who'd listen. The other pilots had families, dreams, futures that had been snuffed out in seconds by sophisticated weapons in the hands of determined enemies. "Santos Ghost," Volkov transmitted, her voice carrying a new edge of determination. "Keep your heads down, I'm coming in hot." She rolled her A-10 into a 40-degree dive, the aircraft's twin engines spooling up as she pushed the throttles forward. The night sky streaked past her canopy as she descended toward the valley floor, her airspeed building toward the red line. At this angle and speed, she would have one pass, maybe two if she was lucky, before the missiles found her. The first SA-18 launched when she was still 2 miles out, its exhaust plume visible as a streak of fire rising from the ridgeline. Volkov had been expecting it, had been watching for the telltale signature of an imminent launch. She jinked hard left, deploying chaff and flares while simultaneously pulling the aircraft into a vertical climb that pushed the G-forces beyond the comfortable range. The missile detonated 300 meters behind her, its proximity fuse triggered by the chaff cloud. But the launch had revealed the position, and Volkov had marked it on her targeting display. Rolling inverted at the top of her climb, she dove back toward the valley with the fury of a woman who had watched 3 good pilots die in the space of 2 minutes. The GAU-8 cannon spoke with its characteristic voice of thunder, each round a depleted uranium penetrator traveling at nearly a kilometer per second. The first SA-18 position disappeared in a cloud of dust and fragmented rock as 30mm rounds churned the earth where the launcher had been concealed. Secondary explosions indicated missile warheads cooking off, sending shrapnel scything across the ridgeline. A second missile launch, this one from a position she hadn't identified. Volkov rolled right, pulling the aircraft through maneuvers that stressed the airframe to its limits. The missile passed close enough that she could see its guidance fins adjusting for her movement, close enough that the proximity fuse should have detonated. But the A-10 had been built to survive battle damage, and its designers had included systems specifically intended to confuse heat-seeking missiles. She was in the valley now, flying between walls of rock that rose on either side like the walls of a canyon. This was the killing zone where Rodriguez and the others had died, where the prepared positions had overlapping fields of fire and nowhere to run. But Volkov wasn't running, she was hunting. The Maverick missile left its rail with a puff of smoke and a solid thunk that vibrated through the aircraft's structure. She targeted the largest concentration of muzzle flashes on the eastern ridge, where intelligence estimated at least 2 heavy machine gun positions were suppressing the Marines' movement. The missile's warhead was small by aviation standards, only 125 pounds of conventional explosive, but precisely placed, it could eliminate an entire fighting position. The explosion bloomed orange against the rock face, followed by the distinctive secondary detonations of ammunition stores. The enemy fire from that sector ceased abruptly, giving the Marines their first breathing room in 20 minutes. But Volkov was already lining up her next target, the aircraft's nose swinging toward the positions that continued to pour fire into the creek bed, where 12 Americans waited for death or rescue. A third missile launch, closer this time, close enough that her radar warning receiver filled the cockpit with urgent tones. Volkov pulled the aircraft into a climb so steep that her vision grayed at the edges, the G-forces pressing her into her seat with crushing weight. The missile passed beneath her aircraft, its seeker head confused by the sudden altitude change and the thermal decoys she deployed. But she was running out of altitude, out of maneuvering room, and most critically, out of time. Her fuel state was approaching the point where she'd have to choose between continuing the engagement and having enough fuel to reach a recovery base. The mathematics of combat aviation were unforgiving. Heroics were meaningless if they resulted in losing the aircraft to fuel starvation. "Ghost, Santos," came the Marine's voice over the radio, strained but professional. "Good hits on the eastern ridge. We can see secondary explosions and the pressure's off from that sector, but we've still got multiple positions engaging us from the north and west." Volkov checked her weapons display, 5 Mavericks remaining, 1,089 rounds of 30 ammunition, and 2 Mark 82 bombs. Against an unknown number of prepared positions with at least 2 confirmed SAM sites still operational. The odds were getting worse with each passing minute, but the Marines were still alive, still fighting, still depending on her. Banking into another attack run, she began her descent back into the Valley of Death. The fourth SA-18 launch came from a position she'd marked as probable but unconfirmed, a cluster of boulders on the western ridge that provided excellent concealment and fields of fire across the valley approaches. The missile operator had waited until she was committed to her attack run, when her options for evasive maneuvers were most limited. It was a patient, professional ambush. the kind of tactics that had made this conflict far more dangerous than the Pentagon briefings suggested. Volkov saw the exhaust plume and immediately rolled inverted, pulling the aircraft through a split-S maneuver that brought her dangerously close to the valley floor. The missile adjusted its trajectory, tracking her movement with mechanical precision. At the last possible second, she deployed her final set of flares and pulled into a vertical climb that pushed the aircraft beyond its design limits. The proximity fuse detonated 20 meters behind her aircraft, close enough that shrapnel peppered the armored cockpit and punched holes through non-critical systems. Warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel, hydraulic pressure dropping, backup electrical systems engaging, fuel flow indicators showing irregularities. The A-10 had been built to absorb battle damage, but it wasn't invincible. Yet the aircraft continued to fly, its twin engines maintaining power despite the damage. Volkov ran through emergency checklists with the mechanical precision of a pilot who had trained for this moment throughout her career. Primary hydraulics were compromised, but the backup systems were functioning. Fuel flow was irregular but stable. She could continue the fight, at least for a few more minutes. The GAU-8 cannon spoke again as she rolled into another gun run, this time targeting the position from which the fourth missile had been fired. The 30 rounds walked across the boulder field like the footsteps of an angry god, each impact sending chunks of stone spinning through the air. She couldn't confirm the kill, but the position went silent, no more muzzle flashes visible from that sector. "Ghost, you're taking hits," Santos reported over the radio, her voice tight with concern. "We can see debris coming off your aircraft. You need to get out of here." But Volkov was already lining up her fifth attack run, this time against the heavy weapons position that continued to pin down the Marines from the northern ridge. Her aircraft was bleeding hydraulic fluid and fuel, damaged but still fighting, like a wounded animal that refused to die. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd finally earned the respect of the ground troops, and it might be the last thing she ever accomplished. The Maverick missile's guidance system locked onto the thermal signature of a heavy machine gun position, its seeker head tracking the heat generated by sustained automatic weapons fire. She squeezed the trigger, feeling the familiar vibration as the missile left its rail and streaked toward the target. The explosion silenced another sector, but there were still multiple positions engaging the Marines. Her fuel warning light illuminated, 15 minutes to bingo fuel, the point at which she'd have to leave the area or risk running out of gas before reaching a recovery base. 15 minutes to save 12 Marines, or abandon them to save herself and her aircraft. The mathematics of survival warfare, where every decision carried the weight of lives in the balance. Kira Volkov made her choice with the cold calculation that had defined her career. She was already dead, had been dead since the moment she decided to enter that valley alone. The only question now was how many Marines she could save before the inevitable conclusion. Banking into her sixth attack run, she descended once more into the killing zone, her damaged aircraft trailing smoke and determination in equal measure. The Marines had been trapped in that creek bed for 37 minutes, an eternity in combat where seconds felt like hours, and death arrived with mechanical precision. Staff Sergeant Santos had lost 2 of her reconnaissance team to the concentrated fire from the ridgeline positions, and 3 more were wounded seriously enough to require immediate medical evacuation. But casevac was impossible while enemy positions continued to dominate the surrounding terrain. Santos had been a Marine for 14 years, had served 3 previous deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, and had never encountered an enemy force this well-organized and equipped. The Taliban fighters weren't the undisciplined militia forces she'd grown accustomed to engaging. These were professionals, possibly foreign fighters or specially trained units, employing sophisticated tactics and advanced weaponry with devastating effectiveness. "Ghost Santos," she transmitted during a brief lull in the incoming fire. "I don't know what kind of magic you're working up there, but it's keeping us alive. We've got 2 KIA and 3 urgent surgical casualties. Whatever you're going to do, we need it now." Volkov's response was delayed. She was in the middle of another attack run, her damaged aircraft diving toward a cluster of positions on the western ridge. Santos could see the A-10 silhouetted against the stars, trailing what looked like vapor or smoke from battle damage. The pilot had been engaging superior numbers for 15 minutes, absorbing missile attacks and ground fire while systematically eliminating the threats that were killing Marines. The sound of the GAU-8 cannon echoed across the valley like sustained thunder, each burst lasting exactly 2 seconds, the precise timing that maximized ammunition conservation while delivering devastating firepower to target areas. Santos had worked with close air support throughout her career, but she'd never seen a single pilot engage this many targets under these conditions. Ghost wasn't just providing air support. She was single-handedly fighting a battle against overwhelming odds. Another Maverick missile streaked down from the darkness, its warhead detonating against a position that had been suppressing the Marines' eastern flank. The explosion silenced the heavy machine gun that had been preventing any movement from their position, finally giving Santos the opportunity she'd been waiting for. She could move her wounded, could begin the tactical withdrawal that might save what remained of her team. "Marines, we've got a window," Santos called to her remaining troops. "Corpsmen, get the wounded ready to move. We're displacing to the secondary rally point in 30 seconds. But even as she coordinated the movement, Santos could see more muzzle flashes appearing on the ridgeline. The enemy had reserves, fresh positions that were now engaging the lone American aircraft. Ghost had bought them breathing room, but the tactical situation remained desperate. They were still outnumbered, still surrounded, still dependent on a single pilot who was fighting impossible odds in a damaged aircraft. The 5th SA-18 launch lit up the valley like daylight, the missile's exhaust plume visible as it climbed toward the A-10. Santos watched in horror as the weapon tracked the aircraft's movement, its guidance system adjusting course as Ghost attempted evasive maneuvers. This time, there was no dramatic escape. The missile detonated close enough that the shockwave was visible, close enough that debris rained down across the valley floor. Ghost, report status," Santos transmitted, her voice cracking despite her professional composure. The radio remained silent for long seconds, filled only with static and the distant sound of small arms fire. Then, incredibly, the familiar voice responded. "Santos, Ghost, still here, still fighting. Aircraft's pretty banged up, but she's still flying." The pilot's voice was steady, professional, betraying no sign of fear despite the circumstances. "I've got maybe 10 minutes of fuel and ordnance left. Let's make them count." Santos felt a chill of recognition. She'd heard that tone before, in the voices of Marines who had accepted their fate but refused to quit fighting. Ghost wasn't planning to make it home. She was planning to spend every last round, every remaining minute, keeping the Marines alive. The realization hit Santos like a physical blow. This pilot, this woman whose call sign had once been a source of squadron jokes, was preparing to die for Marines she'd never met, in a valley whose name would never appear in the history books. It was the kind of sacrifice that defined the warrior ethos, the willingness to pay any price to protect those under her care. "Understood, Ghost," Santos replied, her voice thick with emotion she couldn't entirely suppress. "We're moving to extract. Whatever happens, we won't forget what you've done here." The A-10 banked into another attack run, its damaged silhouette stark against the pre-dawn sky. Santos gathered her wounded and began the movement that might save their lives, while above them, a lone pilot prepared for her final engagement. Major Patricia "Iron" Mackenzie had been monitoring the tactical frequency from Bagram Air Base when the first aircraft went down. As the senior pilot in the 354th Fighter Squadron, she'd been awakened by the operations duty officer and briefed on the developing situation in the Helmand Valley. 4 A-10s engaged, 3 confirmed destroyed, 1 still fighting against impossible odds. Mackenzie had served 2 previous combat deployments and had accumulated over 400 hours of combat flight time, but she'd never heard anything like the radio transmissions coming from Reaper 4. The pilot's voice remained calm and professional even as she engaged multiple surface-to-air missile sites with a damaged aircraft and dwindling ammunition. It was either the most heroic action Mackenzie had ever witnessed or the most spectacular case of pilot error in judgment. "Control, Iron Lead," Mackenzie transmitted to the operations center. "I'm requesting immediate launch authority for close air support. We've got Marines in contact, and one of our birds is about to flame out trying to save them." Colonel Webb's response carried the weight of a commander who had already lost 3 aircraft and was reluctant to risk more. "Iron Lead, be advised the threat environment is extremely hostile. Confirmed SA-18 sites with competent operators. Recommend you wait for SCAD suppression before entering the area." Mackenzie checked the tactical display showing Ghost's position. The lone A-10 was conducting attack runs in a valley surrounded by confirmed missile sites, her aircraft systems degrading with each engagement. The pilot was running out of time, fuel, and luck in equal measure. Waiting for suppression of enemy air defenses might be the tactically sound decision, but it would also mean abandoning Ghost and the Marines to their fate. "Control, Iron Lead is launching with or without SCAD support," Mackenzie replied, already moving toward her aircraft. "One of ours is in trouble and Marines are dying. We don't leave our people behind." As she ran through her pre-flight checklist, Mackenzie found herself thinking about the pilot call-signed Ghost. Kira Volkov had always been an enigma in the squadron, competent but quiet, professional but distant. The other pilots respected her skills but questioned her aggression, her willingness to push the envelope when the mission demanded it. Tonight, that question was being answered in the most dramatic way possible. Mackenzie's A-10 lifted off from Bagram at 4:19 hours, climbing into the pre-dawn darkness with full ordnance load and maximum fuel. She had 23 minutes of flight time to reach the Helmand Valley, where a fellow pilot was writing the kind of legend that would be discussed in ready rooms for decades to come. Whether that legend would end in triumph or tragedy remained to be seen. Banking south toward the mountains, Mackenzie pushed her throttles forward and prepared to join a battle that was already being decided by one pilot's refusal to abandon the fight. The 6th attack run brought Volkov so low over the valley floor that her wingtips nearly scraped the rocky outcroppings on either side. She was flying through a canyon now, with walls rising on both flanks and enemy positions firing down from elevated positions. It was tactically insane, but it was also the only way to deliver ordnance accurately while avoiding the remaining SAM sites. Her targeting pod had identified 3 heavy weapons positions still actively engaging the Marines' position, clustered around a natural fortress of boulders that provided excellent protection from conventional air attacks. The positions were positioned to support each other, with overlapping fields of fire that made them nearly invulnerable to ground assault. But they had one weakness. They were all oriented toward the valley floor, not toward an aircraft approaching at terrain level. Volkov selected her last 2 Mark 82 general-purpose bombs, each carrying 192 pounds of high explosive in a steel casing designed to fragment into lethal shrapnel. The weapons were unguided, requiring her to overfly the target area at extremely low altitude to ensure accuracy. At her current speed and altitude, she would have exactly one opportunity. There would be no second pass, no chance to adjust for targeting errors. "Santos Ghost," she transmitted as she lined up for the bombing run. "I'm making one final pass with heavy ordnance. Keep your people down until I give the all clear." The Marines' response was immediate. "Roger, Ghost. All stations hunker down. Danger close inbound." Volkov armed the bombs and began her final descent toward the target area. Her airspeed was now pushing 350 knots, fast enough that the terrain blurred past her canopy in an indistinct rush of gray stone and dark shadows. The bomb sight pipper tracked across her heads-up display, moving toward the cluster of heat signatures that represented the last major threat to the Marines' survival. The first bomb released with a mechanical thunk, followed immediately by the second. Both weapons arced downward on ballistic trajectories, their fins stabilizing their flight path as they fell toward the target coordinates. Volkov immediately pulled into a vertical climb, pushing the throttles to military power as she attempted to clear the blast radius before the weapons detonated. The explosions came milliseconds apart, twin fireballs that illuminated the valley walls and sent shockwaves rippling across the desert floor. The heavy weapons' positions disappeared in clouds of dust and debris, their concentrated fire silenced permanently. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition stores cooked off, sending tracers streaking across the darkness in random patterns. But Volkov's climb had brought her into the engagement envelope of the final SA-18 position, the one threat she hadn't been able to locate and eliminate. The missile operator had been patient, waiting for exactly this moment when the American pilot would be committed to a vertical climb with limited maneuvering options. The missile launch was perfect, timed precisely, positioned optimally, guided by an operator who understood both the weapon's capabilities and the target's limitations. Volkov saw the exhaust plume too late, deployed her last flares too late, attempted evasive maneuvers that came seconds after the missile's guidance system had already computed the intercept solution. The SA-18 detonated 15 meters from her aircraft, close enough that the fragmentation warhead shredded everything that wasn't protected by the A-10's armored bathtub. Both engines took multiple hits, their compressor sections destroyed by high-velocity fragments. Hydraulic lines severed, electrical systems failed, and fuel began streaming from ruptured tanks in twin vapor trails that caught fire from the damaged engines. Kira Volkov found herself flying a burning aircraft that was rapidly transitioning from controlled flight to ballistic trajectory. Her ejection seat was still functional, the canopy transparent enough to see through despite the spider web of cracks from shrapnel impacts. She could punch out, could trust her survival training and extraction procedures to get her home eventually. The Marines were safe. Her final bombing run had eliminated the last organized resistance in the valley. But as she prepared to reach for the ejection handles, Volkov noticed something that changed her calculations entirely. Her aircraft's death spiral was taking her directly over the position where the final SA-18 had been fired, where the missile operators were probably already preparing to engage the next American aircraft that entered the valley. Her damaged A-10 still carried 847 rounds of 30 ammunition, enough for one final act of vengeance against the people who had killed her wingmen. Instead of reaching for the ejection handles, Captain Kira Ghost Volkov pushed her stick forward and aimed her dying aircraft at the enemy position that had finally brought her down. If she was going to die in this nameless valley, she would take the bastards with her. The final seconds stretched like hours as Volkov guided her burning aircraft toward the missile position hidden among the rocks. Her engines were dead, both turbofans destroyed by the SA-18's fragmentation warhead, but she still had altitude and airspeed enough to reach the target. The A-10 had become a guided missile, 30,000 pounds of metal and high explosive diving toward the Earth at terminal velocity. Through her cracked canopy, she could see the Taliban fighters scrambling away from their position, finally understanding that the American pilot wasn't planning to eject. Some were running toward prepared escape routes, others were diving for cover behind inadequate protection. A few stood frozen in place, probably unable to process the reality of an aircraft being used as a kamikaze weapon. Volkov's hands remained steady on the controls despite the aircraft's violent shuddering as it broke apart around her. Parts of the wing structure were failing, pieces of the fuselage streaming away in the slipstream, but the core of the aircraft, the armored cockpit and the massive GAU-8 cannon remained intact. She had maybe 10 seconds before impact, 10 seconds to ensure that the enemy position would be completely destroyed. At 5 seconds from impact, she squeezed the trigger for the final time. The cannon fired its remaining ammunition in one continuous burst, 847 rounds of depleted uranium streaking toward the target in a cone of destruction that preceded the aircraft itself. The gun fell silent just as the A-10 struck the rocky outcropping where the missile launchers had been concealed. The explosion was visible from 30 miles away, a pillar of fire that rose above the valley walls and painted the surrounding mountains in orange light. The ammunition stores from both the aircraft and the enemy position detonated simultaneously, creating a fireball that incinerated everything within a 100-meter radius. When the flames finally subsided, there was nothing left but a crater and scattered pieces of metal too small to identify. Staff Sergeant Santos and her remaining Marines watched the destruction from their position in the creek bed, their faces illuminated by the distant fire. The valley had fallen silent for the first time in 40 minutes. No gunfire, no explosions, just the whisper of wind across stone and the distant sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the east. "Ghost Santos," the Marine transmitted into her radio, though she knew there would be no response. "Mission accomplished. We're all going home because of you." Her voice broke on the final words, the professional composure finally cracking under the weight of what she'd witnessed. The rescue helicopters arrived 15 minutes later, finding 12 Marines wounded but alive in a valley littered with destroyed enemy positions. The pilots reported extensive battle damage throughout the area, evidence of the kind of engagement that would normally require multiple aircraft and extensive planning. That it had been accomplished by a single pilot in a damaged aircraft defied every tactical manual and rules of engagement protocol. Colonel Webb received the after-action reports 3 hours later, along with confirmation that Captain Kira Volkov had died in the destruction of her aircraft. The pilot who had been considered a liability, whose call sign had been assigned as a gentle mock,